Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of Policy Watch with me, Frank Pereira. India has a serious hunger problem and ranks 100th out of 119 countries on the Global Hunger Index, behind North Korea, Bangladesh and Iraq, but ahead of Pakistan. The country's serious hunger level is driven by high child malnutrition and underlines need for stronger commitment to the social sector. The International Food Policy Research Institute said in its report, India stood at 97th position in last year's rankings. The GHI, now in its 12th year, ranks countries based on 4 key indicators: undernourishment, child mortality, child wasting and child stunting. The report ranked 119 countries in the developing world, nearly half of which have extremely alarming or serious hunger levels. On this edition of Policy Watch, we will analyze if the government's poverty alleviation program needs a revamp. Joining me on the program today are Nitin Desai, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and A.K. Bhattacharya, Editorial Director of the Business Standard. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on this edition of Policy Watch. Mr. Desai, I'd like to begin with you, of course. Why is it that we time and again fail to address some of the basic needs of the people below the poverty line?
I would say that perhaps here one has to look. First, I would not sort of sweat too much over these global comparisons. A lot has been made about the fact that you were 55 and now, but it's a mistake because that was a much smaller group of countries. If you add the 44 relatively well-off countries which have been added in the new one, then there's virtually no difference between where we were then and now. If you look at the past 25 years of the Global Health Index, there has been a steady decline in India. I have a little puzzle also, which is, for instance, if I look at the numbers, for the past 25 years, what is called wasting in children, children being underweight relative to their height, has remained more or less the same at around 20%. It went down, went up, it was sort of more or less the same. But stunting, which is the height relative to age, has come down. Now, I don't see how to reconcile this. The second thing that I would like to stress is that I think the problem is more than just below poverty line. If you look at the numbers in India, you get significant undernourishment, stunting and wasting in the highest income decile. That could not be due to poverty. In the highest income decile, that cannot be due to poverty. So I think we need to do 2 things. One, of course, we have to address the issue which arises from poverty, but we also have to have a closer look at how are we measuring these things. Second, that there are probably other factors besides nutrition, and one which strikes me as which could explain even why it is there in the upper income groups is water. The fact that if you don't have clean water, the absorption of nutrition, particularly by children, comes down. Now that could explain, particularly in rural India, why even in a well-off family, the children may be undernourished, not because they're not eating.
So the problem is not limited to BPL, it's across the board is what you're saying.
It's across the border, and it's not limited to just food intake. It may involve other issues like water, control of other diseases, and so on. But I have no doubt that this, and I would frankly not worry about where we stand in a global ranking. To me, the fact that we have 15% undernourishment in India is a problem which we must address.
It's a problem, yes.
To me, the problem that 38% of our children are stunted is an issue.
Sure.
That is what we should address. Forget about where we stand in ranking.
Point taken. Forget about the ranking, but there is an issue. It needs to be addressed.
Yes.
Mr. Bhattacharya, how do we address this issue? There are several schemes that have been launched by various governments, not just this present government. There have been schemes in the past as well, precisely to address some of these problems. Have those schemes worked? What needs to be done?
Well, I think it is important to address the issue of health and hygiene. And I don't think we pay enough attention to the question about hygiene. The point that Mr. Desai talked about of water is very important here. What kind of situation are we creating for making sure that the children of this country get clean water and even live in proper sanitation? Now, if you have the combination of contaminated water and lack of proper sanitation, I think create a lot of health and hygiene challenges which contribute to not only malnourishment but also of wasting and stunting, and of course in severe cases infant mortality. But let me say that infant mortality, these are the four major yardsticks on which the hunger index is judged. Infant mortality, we have made some progress, and we actually in the Millennium Development Goals we have actually we achieved our target, so which is a good thing. But I think the focus now has to be on health and hygiene, for which if you take the overall expenditure on health, this is abysmally low, and the first thing that the government must do is that the allocation of expenditure on health and hygiene has to be raised. If you look at an urban center like Delhi, for the last 10 years, the capacity of hospital beds, just hospital beds, is actually in the government sector has remained the same in the last 10 years. All that addition that we have seen is in the private sector, and therefore the aam aadmi, the common man, although there are allocations for health assistance for the poor people even in a private sector hospital, but the access is limited, and therefore the challenge of making sure that a man who stays healthy and doesn't fall a victim to diseases even like the current season, the dengue and the chikungunya kind of diseases. So therefore it is very important to first invest a lot in health and hygiene, creating facilities so that people don't fall sick, and especially at the formative stage when they are infants. And of course goes along with that is the vaccination program.
Sure.
I think there is a major social awareness program that is needed. There are various agencies which actually have come up with reports that how on a vaccination program there are social resistance which comes in the way of proper vaccination, which is the surest way of making sure that the child is not only remains nourished but also is its basic health requirements are taken care of.
That's a very valid point that you've made. Social awareness also needs to go a long way so as to ensure that the people know what exactly needs to be done as far as vaccinations and other issues are concerned. But Mr. Desai, let's talk about health, the issue of health that Mr. Bhattacharya has just raised. The government, I think 9 or 10 years ago, launched its famous health insurance scheme, but even that seems to have failed. What is it called? Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana. Even under that scheme, the people don't seem to be getting the kind of benefits that they should be getting.
Moreover, that particular scheme only compensates people for hospitalization. Frankly, a poor family does not like hospitalization. They prefer to outpatient treatment because at least they don't have to forego wages. So that scheme, the evaluations that I've seen have not been very positive. In any case, what we are talking about in the context of the Global Hunger Index is what I would call public health. We are so busy setting up an AIMS in every state. Why don't we focus as much attention on setting up a major public health setup in every state?
Primary health centers.
Primary health center and public health setup. Today public health is a major discipline in developed countries, when the people who need it most are in our country. Show me, which is the major center of public health that you can name in India? Something comparable to, let's say, what the Johns Hopkins Center of Public Health is, or the Harvard Center of Public Health is. Show me one in India which has that standing. We are all busy with AIMSs and super speciality. So I would say let's start focusing attention on primary health care, public health, which is a major part of it is sanitation and water supply and control of communicable diseases, and reach children when they most need help, which is before they go to school, in the Anganwadis and elsewhere. Because this is where the big difference comes. That if a child grows up somewhat sickly and emaciated, then there's not that much you can do to correct the matter afterwards. We've had a midday meals program. We have an Anganwadi program. I think we should really now start looking at the first 5-6 years of an Indian's life as the time when the government must devote full attention to providing every possible form of support. Then the rest will take care of itself. And women's education.
Right.
We've seen examples where if women are educated, then a lot of benefit is delivered to children. In Kerala, for instance, all women wash their hands. You know, it's a common.
It's a basic thing. Yeah,
it's a basic thing. They just wash their hands. They're just so used to it. Unfortunately, everybody else does not do it in India, and yet it makes a huge difference.
Yes,
in terms of the health of children. So
sure.
Little things like this, which we can aggregate. You know, Swachh Bharat, Swachh Haath Karo.
You know, talking about Swachh Bharat and talking about sanitation, you know, the government has taken up this open defecation-free India on a war footing, you know, but yet 60% of the world's open defecation happens in India, Mr. Bhattacharya.
Yeah.
What seems to be the problem, and why can't we address something as basic as this?
Well, you know, I mean, this is a problem that cannot be solved in one day or 1 month or 1 year or even 2 years. I think the Swachh Bharat campaign, I personally feel, is a good campaign, and creating toilets and making sure that they are well maintained is very important. No, you know, the focus is right now mostly on building toilets, but I think the focus should be equally on maintaining the toilet and making sure that those toilets continue to remain used. And there are social habits there. People don't want to use toilets because they think it is unclean. So both building toilets is important, and even if you build toilets, you will not be able to achieve the goal of making this country open defecation free unless you are ensuring that those toilets that you have built are free, are maintained well. Now, along with that comes when you have the Swachh Bharat campaign, you are not investing enough in garbage treatment in this country. The number of cities that one can count in this country do not have adequate capacity to treat the garbage before they get into the river systems or the water reservoirs. Now, this actually leads to a lot of the water contamination, and the water problem that Mr. Desai talked about in earlier is actually because of that. So your Swachh Bharat campaign, toilet free, open defecation free India cannot be a goal in itself. It must come along with investments in garbage treatment, investments so that the toilets that you create are actually well maintained, and then an education campaign by which people are encouraged to use those toilets.
Okay, so we need a multi-dimensional approach. Just addressing one problem is not going to do away, all the other problems as well. All right, on that note, then I'll have to call it a wrap on this segment of Policy Watch. I'd like to thank Nitin Desai and AK Bhattacharya for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. It's time now for a short break. On the other side, we will analyze if the GST needs a rejig to cut the burden on small businesses. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Policy Watch with me, Frank Pereira. With the new GST regime firmly entrenched, a complete overhaul of the tax rates is now required to reduce the burden on small and medium businesses, Revenue Secretary Hasmukh Adhia has said. Now, there are indications that the next GST Council meet on November 10th will announce significant changes. Nearly 4 months since its introduction, the new indirect tax threw up teething troubles and compliance issues which the GST Council has addressed through several rounds of changes. A section of the bureaucracy feels frequent revision of GST is not good, and only around February or March some revisions should be done. But the state finance ministers are eager to soothe nerves and frayed tempers. In our next segment, we will analyze if an overhaul of tax rates is the way forward. Joining me on the program now are Subhomoy, Bhattacharjee, consulting editor of the Business Standard, and Ajay, Shankar, former secretary, DIPP, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on this segment of Policy Watch. Mr. Shankar, I'd like to begin with you, of course. What are your thoughts on what the Revenue Secretary said a couple of days ago?
I think this is good news, because there is willingness to recognize difficulties and to take action to set things right. Because GST is a reality. But a GST which hurts SMEs, MSMEs in the way there are reports that they are being hurt is obviously not a good idea, because it's a highly labor intensive sector, it gives social security and it adds to our growth rates. So any shock therapy to the MSME sector is not a good idea. I don't think it could have been the intention, and therefore the sooner it is set right, the better it is.
Okay. You know, That said, Subhomoy, can we expect some major changes when the GST Council meets on November 10th in a few days from now?
Frank, I'm not that optimistic for the simple reason that the rates have just come into play. The GSTN is still, has teething troubles. Plus the fact that there are large segments of industry, Mr. Shankar referred to rightly about the SME sector, they themselves are getting acclimatized to the new rates. So I don't think December change is on the cards, because as it is, there are lots of things which they need to sort of sort it through. In fact, I think the Revenue Secretary, when he said complete overhaul, after that there was a fresh report that PTI put out saying that he said there's some changes needed, which, so both I suppose are correct, which basically means that the major change will be done by the GST Council probably about, say, April or March, when the new financial year kicks in. Because right now, even if they try to do, and the two big things in the market, the tax on alcohol and the tax on petroleum sector, these two are not yet sorted out. Real estate, there's a problem. To bring all of these things into the GST right now, and also to do substantial change, because what is the change that you can bring in? That you basically cut down 28 to something like an 18% rate.
Yeah.
It's a great idea. In fact, as the Kelkar committee had said, that the rates should have been 6 and 6%, 12% GST, that was ideal. So it's good that, groundswell of opinion is coming along to say, yes, we should have a very low rate of GST, which is exactly what is it all about. But at this stage, too fast, I don't think it'll be happening now. It'll definitely be happening, but probably a bit later.
Almost 4 months since we've seen GST come into being, Mr. Shankar. And like Subhomoy Bhattacharya just said, there has been a lot of tinkering over the last 4 months. Each time the council has met, you've seen some new kind of, rules or regulations that have come about. Do you believe that we need to tinker with the GST this often, or like some of the bureaucrats have said, that we need to wait, see what the problems really are, and take a holistic approach sometime in the future?
Well, ideally, I would agree that you should let things play themselves out, take your time, review, and then act. But this is not an ideal situation. I think the distress in the MSME sector is genuine, and therefore, if to address the pain in that sector, some tinkering is required or some major changes are required, I think the sooner they are undertaken, the better it is. Now, changes are in two directions. One is on the rates. Now, clearly, if in labor intensive sectors, the rates are a little high or on the higher side, then there is a very strong case for lowering them. Ideally, rates on the labor intensive sectors should have been the lowest. So, if there is an aberration there, the sooner it is set right, the better it is, and I don't think there is scope for too much debate on that. On the procedural side, the need for tinkering is greater, because what has happened is that in order to ensure that there is no tax evasion, a shock therapy has been imposed in terms of the compliance requirements. Now, that system is in place. So, to the extent it can be relaxed, liberalized, softened, and things made easier for small and medium enterprises who do not have the computer skills or the resources to hire experts to do the compliance, I think it would be a good step in that direction. Now, how far to go, what to do, is a matter of detail which I think can and should be settled. I believe serious engagement with representatives of MSME is now taking place before the next GST Council meeting.
Subhomoy, Ajay Shankar has raised both the issues, the issue of rates as well as the procedural compliance requirements. As far as the MSMEs and the small businesses are concerned, do you believe that they are more concerned about the rates, or the real problem is some of these procedural requirements?
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say it's both, but let's take it this way. Rates definitely is a problem for MSME, because many of them feel that there are many products, as Mr. Shankar rightly pointed out, many products moving on to the highest tax bracket for no good reason. So, definitely there's a case for relook at all the rates. In fact, 28% is, frankly speaking, way too high. Even 18 is way too high. We should be somewhere near 12. That's definitely a point. Also, there's definitely a point that monthly compliance plus that dangerous thing which the states have said and which they've insisted on, that for service tax, every entity has to take registration in every state. We discussed this thing earlier. Now, that's just simply not necessary if you are going to have a national goods and services common market. Why? It's simply because the states didn't want to give up the sovereignty. If we are going to get the data from the GST network, you can jolly well have one common registration. Why do companies, MSME, for instance, a service company, it actually is hindered from taking registration in 28 states? Then there is a question of monthly compliance. It has now been shifted to quarterly compliance. Yeah. So fine. So that's exactly what is needed. But as I said, ultimately GST is something that's a process. And like every tax system, there would be time through which it will be running through. There will be adaptations and adjustments. But yes, if the big shock things can be, if this period of, when people are making a lot of noise, if that can be brought and made use of to bring in some of the changes, that's good. Except that, again, too many changes would be a bit dicey at this stage, and I don't think the GST Council would be able to take changes in rates wholesale, which is being talked about at so early before the
So don't expect too much come November 10th is what you're suggesting right now. Okay, moving on now, we all expected this, Mr. Shankar. We knew that the GST would cause several of these teething problems, and we knew that, the first 1 year is going to be extremely crucial after the GST is actually implemented. And this is something that the government knew too. Do you believe, to start off with, that the GST should have been made far more simpler than what it is right now?
There's no point going over spilled milk. We have a system functioning. The important thing is to set it right as soon as possible. There is obviously merit in the argument that all the draft rules, regulations, forms, reporting requirements should be out in the public domain and a feedback taken in over some period of time before it was put in place. In all governance issues in a modern complex world, it's always a good idea to put what you intend to do out in a draft form, get feedback, and then take a decision. So now that feedback is coming in, setting it right is a good idea, and as soon as possible. The other point is a mindset point, which is that when you do something as big as GST, there should have been and should be a mental willingness to live with some decline in revenues. To design a system where it's fail-safe in terms of any decline in tax collection is asking for a design which will inflict a lot of pain on people in the market. When you want sustained growth in the medium to long run, GST is supposed to be a game changer. Then willingness to live with some decline in revenues in the short run is a good idea in my view. But this calls for a major mindset change in the people who administer the revenue bureaucracy and the political leaders who control them.
Okay, we need a mindset change, and mindset change across the board is what you're suggesting. But, looking ahead now, how long do you think it's going to take for, to see some kind of a semblance of normalcy as far as the GST is concerned? The Revenue Secretary has said 1 year. Is that a realistic time frame?
It would be, but there's one aspect which is actually becoming a bit of a problem, which is that there are quite a few units, like textiles, for instance, which has traditionally never paid any tax.
Handicrafts too.
But handicrafts is not the problem. In fact, the handicraft guys, poor fellows, they have actually not created as much of a hullabaloo as the textile guys.
Yes.
And textile has never paid tax in India. The Sinvat credit system and others have ensured that they've got because of lots of reasons of employment creation and so on and so forth, they've been out. Similarly, there have been other enclaves made out in the industrial sector. When these guys have come into the tax system, I see that there's going to be a problem for quite some time about them accepting that we have to pay a tax. And frankly speaking, that is a problem there. That paying tax on goods in being sold and actually adding that into the system is as he rightly pointed out, it's a mindset
How do you see things panning out then? I mean, what's the middle path?
No, there's no middle path. There has to be a certain amount of kicking and screaming, and the people will be brought in. What could have been made easier is if the department had ensured that their part of the bargain of keeping it simple. Then your argument becomes much more stronger. That we have kept it simple, but come along to it. By having complicated matters, as Mr. Shankar pointed out, that being very scared that there should be no decline in revenue at all, they have actually created a situation where there's a fight back possible.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of Policy Watch. I'd like to thank both my guests, Subhomoy, Bhattacharjee and Ajay Shankar for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have today. See you again next time.